Solo un recuerdo que este panel va a estar en inglés. Si alguien requiere aparatos de traducción, hay que salir un momentito con su ID o su cédula para la máquina para traducción. Muchas gracias otra vez por venir thank you again for coming to this Inter-American Dialogue event. My name is Faith Corneille. I work for the State Department in Washington for the Energy Bureau out of our embassy here in San Jose, Costa Rica. This is the global panel on electric vehicles, and this panel is going to help everyone understand what are the key trends globally taking place in the marketplace in terms of technology development, battery improvements, cost reductions, and where are we seeing key growth and drivers at the policy and regulatory level for electric vehicles. Transport's share of global CO2 emissions is 23%, and from 2010 to 2015, emissions were increasing at 2.5% annually. We believe electric mobility, and in particular EVs, have an important role to play in decarbonizing the transport sector. Today, there are over 2 million EVs on the road, but this still represents only 0.2% of cars in circulation. There's room to be optimistic, and we think this panel is going to help give everyone clear insights into how the market's developing and where growth opportunities are. Our first speaker is Kate Bloomberg. She is a senior fellow and the Mexico country lead for the International Council of Clean Transportation.
Okay. Thank you so much for inviting me here. I'm excited to be here. If you could do the next slide. Here it is. Where is it? There it is. Okay. Let's see. There we go. So I drive a battery electric vehicle. That's my minivan of bikes. I take my son back and forth to school every day. I live at the top of a very steep hill in San Francisco, and getting down is no problem, but getting back up, I need the motor. And this has revolutionized my life. I go to the store, I do all my shopping, and it's the battery helps me greatly. My son and I, we would be happy to ride our bikes everywhere and do all of our transportation on bike, but my husband, not so much. And we had to buy a new car recently, our first new car ever. I still don't have an electric car. Why? Why is it that I work at the International Council on Clean Transportation. I care deeply about this topic. Why did I not buy an electric car? Well, there's a lot of barriers still out there to electric car ownership. And some of them include things like convenience. We live in an apartment. We're not allowed to drag the plug across the sidewalk and charge the vehicle from the street. We don't actually have a long commute. We mainly use the car for going camping and going on trips. So there are things to be thinking about, but what I'm going to talk about in this talk is what are all the things that countries and cities have done to get over these barriers. And there's a lot being done, and the barriers are falling away pretty rapidly. So I think Costa Rica is in a wonderful place for electric vehicles, and I was very excited to hear everything that Diputada Guerrero Campos talked about. I think this sounds like a great suite of activities, really matches a lot of what I'm going to talk about here. So basically the barriers are model availability, cost, convenience, and consumer understanding. Obviously, I understand a lot about what's going on here in this world. I'm sure that most of the people here, but some of these others are things that we have to get over. The market is growing really rapidly. As Diputada Guerrera Campos mentioned, it's really a technology revolution. Right now, what you see in the pink at the top, the big bar, that's China. The blue, sort of the second largest bar, is the United States. Basically, everything under the United States is Europe. Those are the three biggest markets. And we're going to talk a little bit about what those markets are doing. One of the things that the markets are doing is actually efficiency standards for vehicles. That really sort of gives a long-term vision of what needs to be done, and we're cranking more and more out of conventional vehicles, but also making electric vehicles a better and better option for compliance with standards. So as the standards get more and more stringent, really electric vehicles become an important part of the mix. Oops. Let's see. Okay. As I mentioned, the United States and California, and Europe, and China are the biggest markets. Within the United States, California is very much the biggest market. Why is that? Well, California is a driver of the U.S. market because California has a mandate. They require electric vehicles to be a portion of the sales of the vehicles sold. And so that ZEV mandate, Zero Electric Vehicle Regulation, requires EV uptake. It requires the manufacturers to offer vehicles in the market. It requires them to sell vehicles in the market. So even if the incentives are not enough, I'm sure as BMW will tell you, they do require to sell these vehicles, and so sometimes the manufacturers have to price them lower in order to sell them. Of course, electric vehicle public charging infrastructure is also an important part of it, and you can see that there's a very clear correlation between the share of new electric vehicles on the vertical bar and the public charging points on the horizontal. So that's very important. Whoops. But there's a huge number of other kinds of incentives and things that cities and states are doing to really support the growth of the electric vehicle market. There's city fleet goals, like in Los Angeles. Taxi electrification is happening in a lot of different places. Electric car sharing programs. I'll mention also some other kinds of sharing programs as well. Public bus electrification, free public charging, parking codes, carpool and bus lane access. And then down at the bottom, there's ultra-low emission zones. London is really the first here. So basically, London has set a signal saying, in 5 years, you can't even enter this area of the city unless you are in an electric vehicle. And that gives that long-term perspective. We've got to start making a change in our markets. Of course, the costs are dropping. How could they not with this huge transition going, so much more production? But as you'll see, the bottom line, the ICE, that's the internal combustion engine, that's the average price in the United States. I'm not sure if that's the average price in Costa Rica. So we're coming to parity with the average price in a rich country with a high average cost. Are we coming to parity in Costa Rica? I think that's another question. But fortunately, there's a huge range of electromobility options. I already mentioned my bike. There's scooters. Electric scooter sharing programs are in 20 different cities in the world right now. And these are kinds of things that you can see. So the Red Scoot, that's the scooter sharing program in San Francisco, but there are a lot in other places in the world. And then there's electric buses, which I'm going to talk about for my next 2 minutes and 18 seconds. the greenhouse gas emissions of battery electric buses really depend on the electricity sources. So you can have a range of different kinds of diesels. You could have a range of different kinds of gasoline from biofuels, et cetera. But really, the biggest range is in electricity. And we know that Costa Rica is going to have near zero emissions because they have such a clean grid, which makes it just a great opportunity. But the greatest part of this is that the total cost of ownership of these battery electric buses is already lower than it is for diesels. Now, the upfront cost is higher. You'll see the green bar is the upfront, is the purchase price, but the maintenance and the fuel cost and all of those other costs that go into it are lower. And so over the lifetime of a vehicle like a bus, which is used intensively over long distances every day, the total cost of ownership is much lower. And this was for Bangkok, looking at big buses. The cost is coming down every day. So the total cost of ownership of battery electric buses is going to get even better. We did a study that's coming out soon, which we'll share with anybody who would like to, about the financing and total cost of ownership for battery electric buses. We looked at 20 megacities around the world. What if these 20 megacities, what could they do to get to zero or near zero emissions vehicles? And in that, we included very advanced clean diesels, which basically reduce your emissions by 98% for particles, et cetera. But in that, we saw that even without this requirement that you go to zero emissions, the green bar is the battery electric vehicles. In any case, the battery electric vehicles are part of the least cost portfolio of vehicles. And if you look at just battery electrics, they're lower. They're at least on parity with your current fleet of diesel vehicles, and in some cases can be even lower. So, and one more thing here. Whoops. Is that once you look at the total social costs, obviously the battery electric vehicles are the best option. The total social costs, including the CO2 and other emissions, are much lower for battery electrics. Okay, this is my last slide. I know I'm over. 39 seconds over. Just to let you know, obviously electric passenger vehicles, there's a huge amount of focus in China, in Europe, in the United States. I think it's a great option for Costa Rica, but there are other great options to consider. And buses are one of them. I was out walking in the center of town yesterday. On 3 blocks, I passed 20 buses, relatively empty. I think there's a big opportunity to reform the bus sector in general in Costa Rica, but electric buses could really help you drive that change and put in place buses that are clean, that we don't mind walking by, and that we like to ride in, that are more comfortable and clean. But of course, other ranges of options like smaller, lower range cars, motorcycles, scooters, and of course my favorite, bicycles. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kate. John Gartner to my left is our next speaker. He is the Senior Research Director at Navigant Research, where he leads on transportation and building efficiency research.
Morning, everyone. So following up on Kate's comments about EV ownership, my primary vehicle myself is calorie powered. That's a bicycle. But my secondary vehicle, I did buy a plug-in vehicle last year, and for some of the same reasons Kate mentioned, I do have a garage, excuse me, in my townhouse where I can park and charge my vehicle. But due to the fact that I primarily use it for longer trips, I bought a plug-in hybrid as opposed to a battery electric vehicle, again, just because I don't have the $150,000 to buy a Tesla to get the 300-mile range vehicle, and so I bought a plug-in hybrid. But it's been a wonderful experience. I've really learned a lot, and I think there's a lot of potential as we see more and more of these models coming out into the market, that more and more, it'll address more and more use types for different driving patterns and different types of consumers, and we won't really be there until there's solutions in terms of infrastructure and, as well as the vehicle types, so that the people who fit the demographic, like Kate, who live in an apartment and don't have dedicated charging spots, can reliably charge their vehicle and get around without range anxiety. So being in the, I've been director of Navigant Research's transportation program, involved in EV since 2009, and we're in the forecast business. So looking at what's coming up, have some column charts here looking at what's happening over the next almost 20 years up through 2035. And as you can see to the far left, Asia Pacific is by far going to be the largest market for plug-in electric vehicles. So this is both the battery electric and the plug-in hybrids. It's been really interesting how China has been kind of all over in its electric vehicle incentives. It confounded the market for several years by having incentives, pulling them away 6 months later, having them in some provinces, not in others, having mandates, and then changing those mandates. And however, just in the past 3 years, they've gotten more stable with their incentives and their requirements, and that has seen China go from around the middle of the pack in countries in EV sales to by far and away the #1 leader in global EV sales, and in fact larger than all the rest of the markets combined for any other countries. So that's what happens when you have consistency, government incentives, and a plan, they call it the new energy vehicle plan, to alert the market that EVs are a requirement that will be supported continually and into the future by the government. By 2035, just to give you some examples, in other regions, we expect that 9% of new vehicle sales will be EVs in Middle East and Africa, 37% in Western Europe, 21% in North America, and 25% in Asia Pacific. And this is due to, as we see it now, the varying levels of government support, standardization, emissions targets, and interest and pursuit from the automakers based on those targets and those requirements. So the Latin American market, just have a chart here specifically looking at what's happening here. Right now you don't have the same type of model selections as in South America and Central America as you do in parts of Western Europe and in China and the US. But that will change over time. Auto manufacturers are looking at global EV platforms so that they can easily deliver these vehicles all over the globe, whereas right now they've been originally developed for specific markets, but they're going to be global vehicles. They're going to distribute them all over the world, and so you see much greater selection. So we think coming up the tail end of the curve, really around 2030, 2035, that EVs will start to sell in much greater numbers in Latin America, again, as the infrastructure and investments are in place, as well as model availability, which, as was mentioned, has been a really strong factor in determining how things have gone in the U.S. As I mentioned, much greater selection of vehicles coming out, different types. We've got a Pacifica plug-in hybrid. There's a real need for that crossover SUV vehicle market to be addressed with electrification. I know for four-wheel drive vehicles in places like where I live, where there's a lot of mountainous roads and a lot of snow in the wintertime, four-wheel drive is really a requirement for most drivers, and there are very few four-wheel drive vehicles available today. Certainly in the U.S., we've been waiting for years for Mitsubishi to bring its Outlander plug-in hybrid, which is sold very well in Japan and Europe. So these types of vehicles need to get brought to other markets because the driving requirements are not the same. Obviously, in more moderate climates, you have a different set of requirements and then also the driving range for driving patterns. So all those things have to be addressed by the model selection, and we're very confident, especially with what the folks at BMW and the other German manufacturers have promised to electrify pretty much all of their major lines of vehicles in the next 10 to 15 years. So mobility services, we think this is really going to be transformative and in fact empower the electric vehicle market to a great degree. A lot of talk about mobility and combining mobility services, trying to get the last mile and figuring out what is the right combination of personally owned vehicles, mass transit, and then mobility services. So I'm sure everyone's familiar with what's been happening in many parts of the world with the car sharing and ride hailing programs, getting people out of individual car ownership and relying primarily on things like car share programs that have been developed, some of them by the auto manufacturers, some of them by rental companies or startup companies. Uber and Lyft have had a major impact. And in fact, it's enabling a lot of people in the US, like in Boston, New York, and San Francisco, where car ownership is actually becoming onerous. It's too expensive, you can't find parking, and it's not worth it. And so those major dense urban areas, and we'll see that all over the globe, any place where there's congestion and emissions problems, air quality issues in major cities are going to be really coming up with structures to enable and incentivize mobility services. If you're going to do that, if you're going to encourage these cars to be out there on the road, shuttling people around and figuring out how to work with mass transit, why not make it electric? These vehicles are going to be driven a lot more kilometers in a day than a typical personal owned vehicle, which, as we know, sits idle for 90% of the time. The car's going to be on the road constantly. That means a lot more fuel requirement. That means much greater savings through electricity. Also, electric vehicles, as we know, are more reliable. The maintenance costs are lower. And so if you want to keep these cars, be it in a fleet or a car share program or incentives, you need to create incentives for Uber or Lyft drivers and those types of services to go electric. Because then, even if you are adding net miles, you're still reducing emissions. It doesn't make sense to get people out of mass transit and into cars that are going to be intensifying the carbon usage. Doing electric is much more important, and we haven't really seen that addressed sufficiently in global governments to come up with incentives and programs that can make the financing attractive to fleets and individuals who operate these sharing services to go electric. So without mobility, EVs aren't going to go as far. Without EVs, mobility does not make as much sense. They're really interconnected. And also the fact that these are all connected cars, they have intelligence, they're going to be becoming autonomous, the same way that the mobility services are going to get people out of their cars. Autonomous vehicles are going to have fewer people controlling the vehicles, and again, that means more need for electrification, especially to address the emissions impact. And finally, so looking at the market, in sum, again, huge expansion in the number of models that are coming out there. We're going to go from dozens to hundreds of electric vehicle types, really across the spectrum, from scooters to buses to light trucks to medium heavy-duty trucks in the next 5 years. Really, we think 2025 is going to be the critical point where there's going to be cost parity, as was mentioned, with lowering of the battery costs. And so if the upfront cost is nearly the same and the maintenance and the fuel costs are greatly reduced, then it becomes, why would you want to have an internal combustion engine vehicle? As long as there's infrastructure. And that is a major requirement that has yet to be addressed. It's definitely the chicken and egg syndrome of how can you incentivize infrastructure to be out there ahead of the vehicles when they're not going to be selling enough electricity to pay off the infrastructure investment in 3 to 5 years. That's why we're seeing much greater interest in automakers in investing, and particularly in the U.S., been working very closely with utilities for the past 18 months, getting them invested in infrastructure because they know how to operate it, they know the maintenance, they have the financing mechanisms that they can spread it across the greater ratepayer base. And so we think that there's a huge role for utilities to play, and that's happening now in the U.S., and hopefully that can happen here as well in getting the infrastructure out there for vehicles. And again, the battery technology is improving, so the cars are going to be able to drive further on a single charge. And that means serving a greater variety of needs, being able to tolerate a greater variety of weather conditions, hot and cold, and will really help to grow the market. So with that, I will pass it on.
Thank you very much, John. Our third and final speaker before we open it up to the audience is Guillermo Arias of BMW. He is the head of government and external affairs for the region for Latin America and the Caribbean.
Hello, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. I will present about electric mobility from the perspective of an automaker, manufacturer, where we started in Latin America, being the first company that went into the region with electric vehicles in 2013. And we're very happy of being the first, and we'll show you in this short presentation what our experience has been. And to a large extent, I'm going to validate same things that you're saying. And by the way, I do not own a car. I drive the metro back and forth to work every day. And we have a hybrid at home, and we use it mainly for long trips. And my wife drives, she rides a bike. So yes, very similar. Okay. Oh, it's that one. Okay, so first of all, picking up on what John was saying, there's a revolution in the car industry. What we have is automation. We have all the companies working on automated vehicles. We have a revolution in connectivity, connecting the vehicles to technology. Electrification, it's like Diputada Guerrero was saying, it's not a fad. This is what the world is moving towards, and that's why Costa Rica has also to move along that way. And also sharing. We are working in major cities already. Their cities are congested, they're polluted, and we need to reduce the number of vehicles. It sounds crazy that you hear someone from the auto industry saying we need less vehicles. Yes, we need less vehicles in the mega cities. And we need to move as the car industry to offering shared services for vehicles. It's what makes sense, it's good for the environment, and good for the economy. So just validating just what the colleague said. Then we have different pressures, like John was saying, on the environment, politics, urbanization, the economy, culture, the expectations of clients. So as we're living this revolution, these are the pressures that are driving the automotive industry to change, to make the changes, and everybody's jumping on the wagon to make those changes. Right now, we're participating in that growth. Of each 36 car worldwide sold is a BMW. But each 8th electric car sold worldwide is a BMW i. Like right now we have a limited range of vehicles, but like John was saying, all companies are expanding the offering. The importance of incentives, as you have heard from the other panelists, is very important to break down barriers and to ease the acquisition of electric vehicles. Therefore, we have what we call fiscal incentives in the form of laws that give the consumers tax breaks, support EV usage by, for example, green lanes, and also have the framework. The framework of charging stations is key for the electric vehicles to be able to penetrate quicker into the markets. It is basic. And we are seeing that in Latin America. And it is no surprise that the countries where are selling the most electric vehicles, in this case Mexico and Colombia, are the ones that have higher incentives and the ones that have invested heavily in infrastructure. And we're seeing a rapid change. So it's a simple recipe, and also, like Diputada Guerrero said, we agree completely. We think having incentives in the very long term is not good because it distorts the economics, the market. But a little push, 3-5 years, to be able to compete, especially with the internal combustion cars that receive subsidies, it is very important to have at least a head start on that sense. In the case of California, To give you an example, these are the top 3 motivators for purchase for clients. And we have key one is the environment. In this case, we have examples, the Nissan Leaf, the Chevrolet Volt, and the Toyota plug-in hybrid. Saving money, it is cheaper to maintain an electric or hybrid vehicle than a normal one. The special green lane HOV access, plus other factors. So consumers are responding because there is a worldwide cultural change that perceives that electric vehicles are good for the environment and good for the economy and society as a whole. What have we done in Latin America? We began in 2014. We launched in Brazil, Canada, Mexico, USA, 2015, Chile, Colombia, last year in Costa Rica and Panama, and this year in Ecuador and Uruguay. The good news is that other companies are following. Tesla decided to go into Mexico in 2016, 2 years after. Then we have Nissan also going in, Toyota. So we are being followed. And our motto is the more, the merrier. The more companies come to the party, the more offerings, the more vehicles, the more people will see the technology working, and everybody benefits. It's a win-win for everyone. So if there are any representatives here from other brands, please, please bring the vehicles into the region. Incentives, to give you an idea, this is the current state in some of the key markets where we have. In the case of Colombia, for example, we have no luxury tax for electric vehicles, no import duties. There are no infrastructure incentives, and they do have vehicle use limitations for non-electrics in Bogota. In the case of Costa Rica, as you can see, there's a legislation pending, and it varies across the spectrum. In Argentina, we're planning to launch next year, and we're working with different partners to have the right conditions in the market to be able to go in. All of this will be available by the Inter-American Dialogue, so you can use this presentation in the data. This quickly, I have 3 minutes. It's some of the charging stations that we have set up in Brazil, have in Chile, and we partner with electric companies, in the case of Chile with Chilectra, in Colombia with Codensa, and this is key. Key is to have the partnership with the electric companies. We're working very closely here with ICE in Costa Rica. It's important, and it has to be a joint effort. Car companies must invest in infrastructure, and that is a good signal of goodwill, and usually governments and other companies follow, and we have a viable network for people to use their electric vehicles. This is the case of in Mexico, where we have partnered with malls and shopping centers where they have electric charging stations set up, and universities also. I have mentioned several times the importance of the partnerships. It is a whole ecosystem in order to introduce this technology into different countries, working with government, other companies, companies that are manufacturing the charging partners, General Electric, Schneider, in the case of other car companies, Toyota, Porsche, Nissan. This is the case of Mexico, the central government, local government, cities, etc. It's very important, and that is the only way to move faster on electric mobility. What have we been doing since 2013? Key elements that have allowed us to move very fast. First, we create awareness. Constantly we do meetings, roundtables, workshops throughout the region with key stakeholders, so they know. Es evangelización, like you were saying, to teach people about the upcoming revolution, finding infrastructure partners, gaining political support in the region, initiating projects so people can visualize that, yes, if companies are spending money and investment, it's worth it. Use our dealer network and build a culture within the company to believe in the change of the coming revolution of electric mobility. I have 2 more. And moving forward, this was announced 2 weeks ago at the Frankfurt Auto Show to validate what the colleagues are saying. This year we will deliver 100,000 electric vehicles to customers. By the end of next year, there will be 200,000 on the road. Very important, we are retooling all of our plants worldwide so they can switch manufacturing from conventional vehicles to electrics and hybrids. That's a huge investment, but like John, you were saying, it is key to have that flexibility in production to supply all of the markets. And that's where the industry is heading. By 2025, we will offer 25 electrified vehicles. Again, I'm just validating what the colleagues are saying, and all of the brands are doing the same. This is a sign for those who deny that this is the future. This is the future. We're putting our money where our mouth is. And for example, minis will be all electric by 2019. There will be no more combustion minis. And essentially, we're working hard, fast to maintain BMW being in the vanguard of electric mobility. And last but not least, you can see the report done by the Inter-American Dialogue, where they give these key suggestions for governments in the region on how to expedite the uptake of this technology. I will be open for questions, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's a great panel with 3 experts who have global expertise. I'm going to ask the first question before we turn it over to the audience. Actually, I'm going to ask 2 questions. Both Guillermo and John talked about the importance of working with electric utilities, and considering ICE's very dominant presence here in Costa Rica, I wanted to ask John and Guillermo to talk about what are successful models of characterizing the full value proposition to an electric utility such as ICE? How do you describe the full value stream in terms of charging infrastructure, new business model for services, demand response mechanisms, storage that facilitates integration of variable renewable energy? And then a question for Kate before we open it up to you all. Some governments rely on fuel taxes for revenue, and I would consider that to be perhaps a major impediment to EV scale-up. For governments that do have a fiscal dependency, if you will, on fuel taxes, what have been successful models for dealing with the prospective revenue loss that comes from selling fossil fuel products in the transport sector?
Great. Okay. So I'll go first on the utility question. As I mentioned, it's been the primary focus of my work for the past 18 months. And utilities have gone from basically, at least in the US, and actually we work with clients in Europe and Asia as well, from ignoring EVs to recognizing that they will be something in the future, to then, yes, we need to think about them, but they're sort of an over there, they're an other, to now really thinking about how do we integrate them into our plans, especially in lieu of greater penetration of renewables and the impacts of energy efficiency. So many governments and regulatory bodies have set up incentives to use less and less electricity. That has a revenue cost for the utilities. It's great for the environment that we're using less, not so great for the utilities' bottom line. So they need to use, just as the car makers may be selling less cars, they need to use their resources more efficiently. And that means managing the grid and using the additional load of EVs and controlling it to be of the most benefit. And the utilities have that role. There's a lot of third-party charging networks out there, and they really can't capture the value in the same way that the utilities do. Utilities know how to integrate distributed assets into their grid to deal with renewables, to do demand response, to do peak shaving, to do load shifting. So one of the big things is working, for example, with employers on workplace charging. If you have areas where there's lots of solar being produced during the day, it's okay, and it's actually good to help balance the grid, to incentivize and get EVs plugged in where they can vary the load throughout the day. If you're at your workplace for 8 or more hours in a day, then you can do a slow charge, ramp it up, ramp the charge up during the day when there's excess solar production. Conversely, you can also load shift at night when you may have less demand than the base load requires in places where you have hydro and other assets where there much less variation in the load. You want to set the floor for the energy demand, and by managing EVs, you can do that. And as I said, it also helps to bridge that gap in energy efficiency to say, yes, we're using less. Well, utilities need to pay off their assets. They go with a 30-year cycle. They invest in transmission lines. They invest in generation for a long period of time. Along comes an efficiency, and that upward peak in demand starts flattening. Well, where's the money coming from? There's two options. Increase the charges for ratepayers to make up that difference, or make better use of your assets and create more value by using EVs to balance that. It is the newest, largest load that's going to be coming on the grid as most other products become more and more efficient. Buildings are more efficient, HVAC systems, all these things are becoming more efficient and lowering their needs for electricity. You have EVs come in, and really it's the utilities' place to figure out all those pieces. And as I said, what we're working with them now is figuring out how to integrate with their distributed energy resource programs and saying, yeah, obviously you're thinking a lot about solar, you're thinking a lot about wind. EVs and distributed storage have to be in that same category.
Hello. Yes, just to complement, in our case, throughout Latin America, we have been received with open arms by the electricity companies. In the case of Costa Rica, being a country with a green culture, when we first approached ICE, we had our first meetings, we shared information, experiences from Europe, from Asia. We opened up, and it has just been the same case in Colombia with Chilectra in Chile. So they are a natural partner. It's a natural partnership that I believe all automotive manufacturers, the industry has to maximize the potential. It has a very positive.
To answer the question about fuel taxes, that's a difficult answer, a difficult question to answer. Obviously, it's a great idea to tax the bads, the things we don't want, to help bring up the cost for those and bring down the use. And so taxing fuel, taxing carbon, those are great ideas. But then what do you do when you rely on those taxes for running your government programs? In the United States, for example, basically all of the roads are paid for by the fuel taxes, the roads, bridges, all of those kinds of maintenance. And I think it's still a bit of an open question. What will they be replaced with? What will the new model be? There are ideas about road user fees. There's things like California has a cap and trade program, which is bringing in huge amounts of money but it's really being invested in more lower carbon options and reducing pollution in other ways. So when will we make that transition from fuel taxes to new models? I'm not sure, but I think in these early years, we're seeing actually the efficiency, the growth, the improvements in vehicle efficiency are probably doing more than the electric vehicles to bring down the use of gasoline in places like the United States and Europe. So the gasoline use is already falling, but it's not really EV's fault at this point. But it will. That's as we ramp up. That's going to be a big question, and I'm afraid I don't have the best answer. But I don't know if anybody else has anything to add.
Well, they always say if these decisions were easy, they would have been done already. And they're not.
That's right.
We'll open it up to the audience for questions. There's a gentleman here, and then Marty.
Buenos días, mi nombre es Federico Paredes, soy del Ministerio de Salud. Tengo una duda respecto al enfoque del foro, porque el foro dice transporte limpio, no transporte eléctrico. Entonces, me gustaría saber si se van a tocar alternativas de transporte movido por hidrógeno, por gas, licuado de petróleo, por inclusive plasma, como está investigando el doctor Franklin Chang acá, como opciones adicionales dentro de ese rubro de transporte limpio. Gracias.
We'll take another question from the audience before the panel responds. Here in front, Monica Araya. And then the third question we can take from the gentleman.
Great panel, thank you. I'm from Costa Rica Limpia, and one of the things we've noticed is that there is a very deliberate effort to scare people around the batteries. So people are very prone to believe that now the problem are the batteries, when in fact the bigger problem, is the extraction of fossil fuels. So as a citizen group, we have encountered a lot of myths, a lot of lies, a lot of misrepresentation of this problem. So I would like any of you, perhaps Guillermo, but it doesn't matter, whoever wants to say something, I would like for you to say in a very succinct way what's happening with the batteries. I do have an electric car. I know that the battery is not a problem for 8 years. I have a guarantee and everything. But I would like you to help us dispel the myth that when you buy an electric car, the battery is a problem. Could you please help us here to dismiss that narrative, because it's permeating the debate in Costa Rica and it's not fair.
Okay, why don't we answer? Oh yeah, why don't we answer the first two questions and then we'll come back for additional questions.
I'll take a stab at the first one. Okay. It's a great question. There's a lot of options out there to clean up the transport sector, and actually, internal combustion engines have a lot of have made huge strides in terms of diesel. Now you can get a Euro 6 or a US 2010 diesel for heavy duty. That reduces the particle emissions, number of particles, by 99%. It's the difference in terms of air quality between an electric vehicle and a very clean diesel is almost not there. I mean, there's very little difference. Where the difference comes in is in greenhouse gas emissions. And so especially a place like Costa Rica, an electric vehicle offers you the same 99% reduction, but for greenhouse gas emissions. But I think that the other kinds of technologies, I would say I still am not ruling out entirely fuel cell vehicles. There's still a lot of interest. It could be, in the long run, a cheaper option than battery electric, but battery electric has a big head start right now. And I would say Tesla and China are basically the motivators there, and they've really driven the field forward. So I think that's why you're seeing us focus on battery electric, because it's an option that's available, it's in the market, and it's here, and it's going to be a huge part of the answer to come. So.
Yes, and also regarding the batteries. Okay, yes, you're completely right. Batteries is what is most advanced right now, but nevertheless, all companies have research departments working on different alternatives. In our case, we have a whole new section working on hydrogen. So been doing research. Something has not been discarded, but right now, it's electrics what has picked up the fastest. Also, lithium supplies are not inexhaustible. Therefore, also all companies are working with research companies also on developing ceramic-based batteries for 20 years down the line. So this is evolving very, very, very rapidly, but this is what we have at this time, and it will change. And some parts of the world will decide to use samples that have a lot of natural gas. They will go with natural gas for a while, and it will vary from region to region.
So I'll comment on both questions. fill in and complement what my colleagues have said. On the fuels and efficiency topic, yes, the transportation sector, today operates somewhat regionally in terms of the fuel source that's available, right, and the price. So you have regions where natural gas is abundant and reasonably priced, and so those regions will likely continue to have stronger markets for natural gas. In other places, like in Brazil, for example, where they've made a huge commitment to biofuels, that is likely to continue and be complemented by hybrids and plug-in vehicles. So kind of like the electricity for your home or for this building varies by region based on what the cost and the availability of local fuel stock is, the same thing will happen. So we are talking about EVs. EVs are a leading replacement for electricity, but not exclusively so. And again, it's going to be based on the natural resources that are available and their cost. And there will be a market and even the type of vehicle. So for right now, there really isn't a great solution for long distance trucking that is all electric. The batteries are just too heavy and they would need to be refueled too quickly, recharged too quickly. That may change over time. Right now, natural gas, liquefied natural gas, can be a better solution, or very clean diesel can be a better solution for long-haul trucks. But now they're starting to be light and medium-duty trucks where electrification plays a better role, or at least hybridization, some level of electrification, recapturing energy through the brakes. So yeah, very, very valid point that it's not just EVs in the future. On the other point about the batteries, so yes, that's been a myth, in many regions. One of the first scare tactic was they're going to blow up, they're dangerous, they're going to kill you. Well, what about those liters of flammable fuel in your car? That who has not ever seen a car on fire, right? That happens. Batteries are much safer, it's much harder to penetrate, and they are much less likely to explode, first off, than a flammable fuel like gasoline or diesel. The other part is automotive companies are not risk takers. They do not go out there and put new technology in their vehicles that are not going to work. They don't want to pay on their warranties. And so the fact that they've said 8 to 10 years, the batteries, in terms of just continuing to function safely, they're going to work longer than your power windows. They're going to work as well as anything else on your car. Now, there will be diminished capacity over time, incremental. Not enough, not like your car's not going to start, you won't be able to go somewhere, but maybe in 5 to 7 years, you'll start to see a 5 to 10% reduction in the overall capacity. But that doesn't impact the performance per se. It just diminishes your range. But the batteries are not out there. They're not sold into the market unless they work. And again, that's the history of the automotive industry. You don't see them going out there and putting risky components in a new vehicle.
Yes, that is correct. Just the liability is too high. The liability, personal, criminal liability, we have seen other companies, even executives for falsifying emissions, going to jail, etc. It's too risky. It's too risky. Nobody would put a faulty battery out in the market. Plus, the technology is developing so fast that the ranges that we get from batteries today are not the same that we had 2 years ago, and will not be the same a year from now, because the technology is moving so fast and reliable, and the costs are going down. So it's a complete myth, and so it's more dangerous to have a car fuel of a liquid that can explode.
And just to buttress what has already been said, the U.S. Department of Energy, our Ministry of Energy, indicates that since 2009, battery costs have come down 73%, which is a very rapid cost decline, as you are also seeing in wind and solar technologies. And a lot of that is due to the partnerships that Guillermo mentioned, industry partnerships and R&D, universities to develop more to improve battery density, to improve technology all of the time. The U.S. Department of Energy also has a goal that it sends out to the marketplace as a strong signal to reduce the battery cost to $100 per kilowatt hour down to 80 eventually, and I think, I'm not sure, Guillermo can correct me, or John, that the cost now is around 200 or just over 200 per kilowatt hour. But these are the signals that are being sent through in the marketplace. Additional questions? There's a gentleman in the back, and then the lady to his right. We'll take two more.
Buenos días, soy Adolfo Rubí, trabajo para el grupo Red Motors, representante de BMW en Costa Rica. Yo quisiera escuchar, si se puede, la opinión de los tres expertos que nos acompañan. Yo creo que nuestro país tiene casi todo a favor, una matriz energética casi 100% renovable, la temperatura ideal para las baterías, la topografía facilita la recarga, aprovechar la energía cinética. Pero la pregunta es la siguiente, viendo las matrices, solo nos faltan un par de cosas, nos faltan un marco legal o incentivos más agresivos, y mi pregunta va en ese sentido. Yo no sé si nuestra ley, nuestro proyecto de ley, porque no sabemos qué va a salir de la Asamblea Legislativa, nuestro Congreso es como todos los del mundo, está dejando por fuera a los híbridos eléctricos enchufables, tiene un luxury tax también por otro lado. No sé, es una opinión tal vez hasta personal, no es la transición más natural que el consumidor, al adoptar una nueva tecnología que desconoce, empiece con un híbrido enchufable, el cual además la media en el mercado son unos 45 kilómetros de autonomía 100% eléctrico cuando el carro es enchufable, y el traslado promedio de un tico son 30. Nosotros solo andamos 30 kilómetros o menos al día, se nos hace eterno por las presas, pero son 30. O sea, lo que quiero decir es que podríamos andar casi que todo el día en modo 100% eléctrico, y creo yo que es como más natural que la gente primero se acostumbre a enchufar su carro, vea que puede andar casi todo el día en modo eléctrico, va a haber más dinero en su bolsillo, en fin, yo quisiera, en base a la experiencia de ustedes tres, ver qué opinan, porque incluso los centros de recarga, el ICE tiene centros de recarga, la Compañía Nacional de Fuerza y Luz tiene centros de recarga, cooperativas tienen centros de recarga, solo la marca que representamos hemos instalado ya 8 en el país, públicos, gratis, y la gente carga en la casa. Entonces mi pregunta va en ese sentido, si no es una transición natural, y también cómo se sienten con el tema del luxury tax.
Gracias.
Okay. Hi, I'm Verena Raus. I'm a consultant for the IDB on mobility issues. I have 3 questions. The first one is about the charging stations and the fast charging stations. I hear that some of them are not all compatible with all cars. So I was wondering if you have some information about the trend. How is this going to be approached? Because I hear that Tesla has their own free charging stations for life, but and if there's like some research about it, you could provide like where is that trend going, especially for fast charging stations, because we don't want to have like 4 or 5 different charging stations for every car you have. I think that's one technical question. The other one was I was surprised about how you approached the battery risk, because I wouldn't see it. I didn't ever think batteries were a risk during the usage of the car. I was surprised you didn't approach the other risks they represent. I don't know whether if it's a myth or not, but about the recycling, because I think it's always interesting that in some panels like these, that topic is not really approached, and if it's not approached comprehensively, the regulations about battery recyclings, it can turn into a major risk. So I always think, like, when you talk about incentives and everything, it goes hand in hand, and in some countries where you have a good waste management system, it's obvious that you might recycle them properly, but in other countries where it's not as obvious, the proper regulation needs to be provided. So I was wondering whether you can demythify or whether you can give incentives about the recycling, because that is in fact a risk. And the third one is for Kate, actually, and this one's a sort of a strange question, because I was thinking about like the emission standards for normal vehicle, for diesel vehicles, and about how that is one important step towards the electrification of vehicles, and I totally get where it comes from. Other countries have been implementing emission standards for decades now, and they go stricter every year. And you see in Germany with the diesel scandal and everything, how it actually goes towards a lesser use of the diesel vehicles or also gasoline. Here in Costa Rica, it's been quite a drag to regulate emission standards for internal combustion vehicles. And it's also been quite a drag to limit the importation of used vehicles, and everything's been a drag. So I was wondering, and that's why it's a weird question. Is it possible on a very long term, or how would you see it on a very long term, if the trend goes to 100% of electric vehicles, to just skip the whole emission standard step and say, like, you know what, let's just focus on limiting the imported vehicles, and the trend is going there anyway, so why don't we just stop investing on this regulation, because it's like a drag and it's going to be all electric anyway, so let's just stop focusing on the rear end emissions. I don't know if that's too avant-garde, that's why I said it's a weird question, but I was just thinking about it lately, so I was wondering how you stand on that.
Thanks, Verena. I think it's actually not a crazy question. It's something that we're thinking about a lot. For example, in Bogota, the Transmilenio system is about to buy more than 1,000 new buses, and we were trying to push them to do Euro 6 which, as I mentioned, reduces emissions, particle emissions, by 99%. And they said, we want actually to go to electric, and so we're going to do 20% of the fleet electric. Well, what's the reduction in emissions? With 20% of the fleet electric, you get a reduction in particle emissions of 20%. With 100% of the fleet at Euro 6, you get almost 100% reduction. And so I think obviously, if we're close to getting to Euro 6, there are benefits to doing both. It's not like one stands in the way of the other. And I think there's tremendous benefits to be gained from particle filters. There's a lot of existing diesel buses out there, diesel vehicles. So moving to those cleaner standards. For gasoline, it's less of a difference. So those gasoline vehicles, you could kind of skip it, because the difference in emissions between a Euro 6 and a Euro 4 car is nothing, actually, for gasoline. There's really no difference. When you get all the way to Tier 3 U.S. standards, you do get some substantial reductions, but maybe going to electric vehicles is less important. But for heavy duty, for diesel, there's still a real need, I would say, to do both. I do think some of the manufacturers are worried, well, why should we invest in Euro 6 for these markets if they're just going to electrification anyway? I think we're missing out on a lot of lives we can save, a lot of illnesses we can avoid if we don't really, really push for both of those. On the recycling of batteries, I'll just say that these aren't lead acid batteries anymore. These are batteries that have very high-priced chemicals or metals that are being used. It's not the same thing. There is a reason that you're going to want to recycle this. There's still a value in those old batteries. The lead acid batteries that piled up and leaked and were dangerous, that's a very different value proposition than recycling lithium batteries, nickel metal hydride, all of these other, the new kinds of batteries that we're talking about. There's a real value in recycling them, and I don't think we're going to see the kinds of problems. There is some questions about what the logistics should be, how to do it in smaller countries, but I don't see it as a huge concern personally. If others have ideas.
We have maybe 1 minute left if we can try to keep remarks for Guillermo and John to 30 seconds each.
Yes, and I'll go quickly on the issue of the hybrids. I just refer everyone to the examples. Let's look at where it has been successful. California, Norway, Germany, they all began with subsidies for incentives for full electric and hybrids. And it has worked, it made sense. Why try to do something different if it has worked before? On compatibility, 99.9% of the companies worldwide that manufacture have agreed on certain type of chargers. They vary by region. There's only one company that doesn't want to play along, and they decided to go their own way. But I think it's going to bite them in the end. Yes.
I'll just comment about the charging question in particular. So yes, as was mentioned, there's the CHAdeMO standard for DC fast charging, which came out of Japan and is used by Nissan and most of the Japanese manufacturers. And then there's the SAE, Society of Automotive Engineers standard for fast charging, which is used by basically the German and the US automakers. Those will be two standards. There's no real likelihood that either one of those standards will go away anytime soon. The third wild card, which was mentioned, is Tesla, which has done its own complete thing. A lot of the DC fast charging stations will have certainly 2 plugs, and then Tesla, I think, eventually may have to come around and realize that it's very expensive for them to do their own thing when there will be lots of high power charging, which is moving from 50 to 300 up to 350 kilowatts in charging, going past what Tesla is doing today. So that's the world we are living in. It'll likely be at least 2 standards, and then we'll see what happens with Tesla over time.
If everyone could please give our panel a big round of applause. Thank you, Kate, Guillermo, and John.